Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the torches, putting the dungeon doors back on their squeaky hinges, and sliding slowly into the world of medieval crime and punishment. You know, that cozy place where people thought bleeding someone with leeches was science, and the main way to discourage your neighbor from stealing your cow was to, well, chop something off them. So, make yourself comfortable. Maybe a blanket, maybe a pillow. Don't worry, you won't be the one losing a hand tonight. You're just here to listen. Now, let's drift back in time to a world where stealing bread could actually change your life. Not in the Disney rags to riches Aladdin way, more in the welcome to public shaming with your head stuck in wood kind of way. Punishment for theft in the Middle Ages wasn't one size fits all. It really depended on where you lived, who you stole from, and how unlucky you were that day. England had one approach, France had another, and Germany, well, Germany really loved creative punishments. Of course they did. But let's not run ahead. Let's float gently. First things first, context. Medieval Europe, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, didn't exactly have what we'd call a centralized police system. No flashing lights, no donut breaks. Law enforcement was more of a patchwork quilt. Lords handled justice on their estates, towns had their own codes, and the church, the church loved to weigh into. Nothing like stealing a chicken and then suddenly having theology thrown at you. But theft was everywhere. Life was unstable. Famine could strike. Trade was risky. And people were just trying to survive. Some stole because they were hungry, others because they wanted your fancy new boots. And society, terrified that too much stealing would turn everything into chaos, responded with punishments designed less to rehabilitate and more to make everyone else too scared to try. So, what happened if you were caught? Well, if you were lucky, you might just get a fine. Yes, believe it or not, sometimes medieval courts preferred cash. Because, of course they did. Money solved a lot of problems, even then. Pay your fine, and you could walk away. Though maybe with your reputation in tatters. But if you couldn't pay, that's when things got unpleasant. The next step down the ladder was the pillory. Imagine two wooden boards clamping your head and hands in place while you stood there in the middle of town square. Everyone walking past could see you. They might throw rotten food, mud, maybe a dead animal if they were feeling creative. You were basically the town's temporary entertainment, a human version of bad reality TV, but slower. Sometimes the punishment wasn't just standing there. Thieves might have to wear a sign telling everyone exactly what they'd done, or worse, some ridiculous costume. In parts of Germany, minor thieves were sometimes forced to walk through town with shoes nailed to their feet, which is, let's be honest, both painful and absurdly specific. But then we get to the more serious punishments. And by serious, I mean the ones that involved body parts not sticking around. One of the most common medieval penalties for theft was mutilation. You steal, you lose something, usually a hand, sometimes an ear. Because what better way to warn others than to have former thieves walking around permanently marked? Nothing says, "Don't steal," like a guy missing a thumb. And let's not skip the branding. Hot irons pressed into skin, foreheads, hands, even cheeks, all so the world would know this person once stole something. Which is, if you think about it, sort of like getting a bad Yelp review that you can't erase, ever. Now, there was some logic here, in their own strange way. Jails were expensive. Feeding prisoners cost money. But chopping off someone's a finger? That was quick, effective, and you didn't need to provide 3 meals a day afterwards. Efficiency, medieval style. Let's float over to the gallows for a moment. Yes, execution. For theft. Especially repeated theft. In medieval England, stealing more than a shilling's worth of goods could actually be punishable by death, and people were hanged for surprisingly small crimes. It wasn't just for murder or treason. If you stole livestock, say a sheep, there was a good chance your story ended swinging at Tyburn. But execution wasn't always the go-to. The courts often tried escalating punishments. First offense, maybe a fine. Second offense, maybe the pillory or branding. Third offense, well, congratulations. You've won yourself a ticket to the hanging tree. It's worth pausing on this idea of escalation, because it shows just how obsessed medieval societies were with making examples out of people. Punishment wasn't just for you, the thief, it was for everyone watching. It was a show. And honestly, kind of a dull one if you weren't into watching people stand in wooden boards for 3 hours. But still, a show. Think of it as the medieval version of Scared Straight. Except instead of watching an angry prison guard yell at teenagers, you got to watch your neighbor lose an ear for stealing a loaf of bread. Now, not all thieves were punished equally. Surprise, surprise. Social class mattered. If a poor peasant stole from a lord, expect harsh punishment. But if a noble happened to steal, or let's be honest, seize someone's stuff, they often just got away with it. Nobles had the money and the power to smooth things over. And kings? Well, they basically stole all the time and just called it taxation. There's also the fun layer of church courts. Clergy could claim benefit of clergy, meaning they'd be tried in church courts instead of secular ones. And church courts were famously lenient. You might get away with just a penance, like saying a few prayers, or maybe going on a pilgrimage, which is a much softer deal than losing your nose. So, if you happen to be literate and could read a passage from the Bible, you might wiggle into church jurisdiction. Literacy, in other words, could literally save your skin. It was sort of the ultimate medieval life hack. But what about women? Female thieves often faced similar punishments, but with some gendered twists. Public shaming was very popular. Women caught stealing might be tied to a cart and paraded through town. Sometimes they were ducked in rivers or ponds. And yes, occasionally mutilation too. But the humiliation aspect, the idea of dragging them through the community, was especially emphasized, because nothing says justice like a soggy thief. Let's also talk prisons. Were thieves locked up? Sometimes. But medieval prisons weren't like modern ones. They weren't long-term solutions. They were mostly holding areas while you waited for trial or punishment, or while your family scrambled to raise money for your fine. You didn't usually spend years behind bars for theft. You either paid, got punished, or, well, ended up at the gallows. That being said, some towns did experiment with long-term imprisonment, and the conditions were famously awful. Dark, damp, disease-ridden. The kind of place that, honestly, losing a hand might have been the better option. And of course, the medieval mind loved symbolism. The punishment often tried to fit the crime in some poetic way. If you stole bread, maybe you were forced to carry a heavy loaf around as mockery. If you stole livestock, maybe you were paraded with the carcass. The logic was always embarrass them so thoroughly that others think twice. Did it work? Probably not. Theft continued century after century. But it did give medieval towns plenty of excuses for public gatherings. Think of it as grim community theater. All right, we've set the stage with some of the classic punishments. Fines, pillories, mutilation, execution. In the next stretch, we'll drift a little deeper into the regional quirks, because, as you might expect, Italy did things their way, France had its peculiarities, and Eastern Europe, well, let's just say they weren't shy about getting inventive. But before we float there, let's settle back. Take a breath. Picture a muddy medieval town square, a thief locked in the pillory, chickens pecking at the ground nearby, townsfolk strolling past with the medieval equivalent of popcorn. Justice, they called it. Entertainment, really.
So we've wandered through the basics of medieval punishment: pillories, mutilations, branding, and the occasional dangling from a rope. But you might be wondering, did it look the same everywhere? Not quite. Medieval Europe was a messy quilt of lords, bishops, kings, and town councils, each insisting they had the right idea of how to discourage sticky fingers, which meant punishments varied from place to place, sometimes in almost comical ways. In France, for example, things always had to look just a little theatrical. Even punishment turned into performance art. Instead of a plain pillory, they had the carcan, a wooden collar that kept you bolt upright in the middle of a busy square. No slouching, no hiding, just hours of awkward neck pain while townsfolk wandered by reading aloud the little announcement of what you'd done wrong. Because why not make it a public service broadcast? And if branding was in order, it wasn't just any symbol. They burned a neat little fleur-de-lis, the royal lily, into your skin. Imagine walking through life with the king's logo etched onto your face, a living billboard of both shame and royal authority. And for repeat offenders, hanging, of course, sometimes followed by leaving the body to rot as a grisly reminder. Banishment was also common, sending thieves packing with a stern warning not to come back, which of course usually meant they just became someone else's problem in the next town over. Germany, as usual, leaned into its reputation for inventive efficiency. The pillory was popular, yes, but why stop there? Sometimes a thief had to carry the stolen item through town like a walking comedy act. Stole bread? Carry a giant loaf around your neck. Stole livestock? March through the market square with the animal tied to you, preferably while children laughed and pointed. Shoes nailed to your feet were another delightfully cruel touch, the kind of punishment that makes you wonder who even thought of it. Fingers, ears, or hands might disappear, and branding irons came out often, pressed right onto the face so you could never hide your past. Drowning was also a favorite. Toss the thief into a river and see if God wanted to save them. If you survived, maybe it was divine mercy, and sometimes they even let you go. And if not, well, one less thief to worry about. Italy, full of wealthy city-states and civic pride, took things in yet another direction. Here, reputation mattered almost as much as punishment itself. Public humiliation was a favorite. Parading thieves in silly costumes, strapping donkey ears to their heads, or chaining them to columns in crowded squares where everyone could mock them. Venice, in particular, loved the pillar treatment, forcing thieves to stand chained in the middle of bustling plazas, a kind of human tourist attraction. Branding and mutilation weren't neglected either, with ears and noses often sacrificed to justice. And exile was common too. Simply kick the thief out of the city with instructions not to return. Of course, they usually just walked down the road to another city-state and tried their luck again. And when city leaders wanted to be truly dramatic, there was execution, beheading, hanging, or even tossing the condemned into the Arno River in Florence, a watery reminder that the city took theft very seriously indeed. Further east, things tended to be harsher and quicker. In Slavic lands and Russia, hanging was a common answer to theft. Highway robbers in particular faced terrifying penalties, sometimes even impalement, the kind of gruesome punishment that doubled as a warning sign to travelers. Cutting off noses was also favored in some regions, a punishment with its own brutal logic. A noseless thief couldn't blend in. Everyone could see at a glance what kind of person they were. Banishment existed too, though often in the harsher form of exile to frontier zones where survival itself was questionable. Smaller communities preferred simpler methods, tying a thief in the square, beating them publicly, or parading them through the streets to ensure maximum humiliation. Of course, the church was never far from the action. Clerical courts often stepped in, especially if the accused could read,
which technically made them eligible for benefit of clergy. This usually meant lighter punishments, penance, prayers, maybe a pilgrimage. Imagine avoiding mutilation simply because you could stumble through a verse from the Psalms. That was medieval privilege at its finest. And then there were the ordeals, those bizarre tests of innocence, where someone had to plunge their hand into boiling water or walk across hot irons. If your burns healed quickly, you were innocent. If they didn't, well, apparently God had spoken. It wasn't exactly CSI-level evidence, but people found it convincing. The constant thread through all of this was how public it always had to be. Punishment wasn't something you hid away. It was a performance staged for the whole community. The thief wasn't just being punished for their own sake. They were being turned into an example, a warning, a walking billboard for justice. Children got to point, adults got to gossip, and the authorities got to feel like they'd done their job. It was community theater, grim but strangely necessary in a society obsessed with keeping order through fear. And yet, even with all this creativity, hands chopped off, noses sliced away, heads rolling, bodies dangling from gibbets, theft never stopped. People kept stealing. Hunger, desperation, or just plain greed made sure of that. Nobles got away with it by calling their theft taxation, clergy often slipped by with penance, and the poor bore the brunt of the spectacle. For every thief paraded through a marketplace or branded with a hot iron, another was surely lurking, ready to try their luck. So, as we drift onward, the question becomes less about what the punishments were and more about what life was like afterwards. Imagine walking around branded or mutilated, your crime etched forever into your body. How did people treat you? Could you find work? Did anyone trust you again? Or were you just stuck in a cycle that ended inevitably at the gallows? That's where we'll float next. But for now, picture a thief standing stiffly in a Parisian square, the fleur-de-lis burned onto his cheek, while market women stroll by shaking their heads. Punishment complete. Lesson supposedly.
So, imagine the punishment is over. The crowd has gone home, the pillory dismantled, the branding iron cooled. The thief has survived, maybe minus a finger, maybe with a red-hot mark burned into their skin, maybe just carrying the memory of public laughter. What then? What was life like for someone who had been caught and punished? In many ways, the punishment didn't end with the ropes, the iron, or the whip. It followed you around like a shadow, always there, always whispering. Take branding. A single letter, a mark carved by fire into your cheek or forehead, could destroy every chance at a normal life. Walk into a market and people knew immediately. No introductions needed. You were the thief, the liar, the criminal. People crossed the street to avoid you, or worse, jeered openly. Employers rarely risked hiring someone visibly branded because who would trust a man or woman with a thief's mark around the household goods? Marriage prospects shrank to nearly nothing. Unless you found someone equally desperate, the branded thief often drifted to the edges of society, surviving by begging or, ironically enough, more stealing, which then led to harsher punishment. The cycle almost seemed designed to keep them trapped. And mutilations worked the same way. Lose a hand, and your ability to work collapsed. How do you plow a field or craft shoes with just one hand? Lose an ear, and the shame alone marked you out forever. Nose missing? You couldn't hide it, not even with a hood. Children laughed, adults sneered, and all of this was intentional. Medieval authorities wanted these punishments to be lifelong. They weren't simply about stopping you once. They were about making sure everyone who saw you in the future remembered the lesson. A walking warning, a breathing deterrent. But not every branded or mutilated thief stayed beaten. Some leaned into their roles. Highwaymen, for instance, often had nothing left to lose. Already marked, already despised, they turned to open banditry, living on the edges of law and society. These men became legendary in some places, both feared and, oddly enough, admired. After all, they were breaking rules everyone hated. Taxes were crushing, nobles were greedy, and sometimes the thief who robbed a fat merchant wagon seemed like a folk hero, even with a branded face. Stories and songs sometimes painted them as romantic rebels, though reality was usually far less glamorous. Most died young, dangling from a rope on some lonely crossroads. Exile and banishment brought their own misery. Being cast out meant losing your family, your community, your safety net. In an age where survival depended on belonging, being told to leave was almost as dangerous as losing a limb. Wanderers were suspicious by nature. Why was this man traveling alone? Why didn't he belong anywhere? People knew the answer before it was spoken. He must have been punished somewhere, which meant suspicion piled on quickly. Strangers could be beaten, turned away, even killed without much consequence. So exiled thieves often had no real path forward except to join outlaw bands, roaming forests and mountains like wolves without a den. But not all punishments were physical. Sometimes the cruelty was quieter, more psychological. Shame, after all, was its own weapon. A thief paraded through the square wearing donkey ears or ridiculous costumes didn't just suffer for a day. They became a joke, a punchline, a memory people never let them escape. Imagine living in a small town where everyone had seen you crawling with a loaf of bread tied to your back. You couldn't erase that, no matter how many prayers you whispered or how hard you worked later. Medieval society thrived on memory. Stories were passed on like heirlooms, and being remembered as the thief stuck forever. Of course, some found ways out. The church sometimes offered a softer landing. Pilgrimage, for example, could serve as both punishment and redemption. A thief sent off to walk barefoot to Compostela or Rome at least had a chance to reinvent themselves. Distance helped. In a faraway city, among strangers, maybe you weren't the branded criminal anymore, at least not until someone looked too closely. Monasteries, too, sometimes absorbed the desperate. A branded thief might beg admittance, hoping that prayer and service could scrub their past away. Not every abbot was willing, but some saw repentance as genuine. For a few lucky souls, the cloistered walls of a monastery became their escape route from the endless shame of punishment. But for most, the truth was far harsher. Punishment wasn't a clean break. It wasn't a moment you endured and then walked away from. It was a brand on your skin, a scar on your body, a stain on your name. It turned you into a second-class person forever. And in a society obsessed with reputation and communal memory, there was little chance to climb back out once you'd been pushed down. That's the real cruelty of medieval justice. Not just the pain of the moment, but the life it left behind. Still, people kept stealing. Hunger pressed harder than fear. A starving child would still reach for bread, even knowing what it might cost. And so punishment rolled on. The pillories filled again, the branding irons reheated, the gallows built higher, a cycle without end, grinding on through centuries, shaping the very fabric of medieval life. Because as much as authorities wanted to terrify people into obedience, desperation always whispered louder.
By now, you've probably noticed that medieval punishments weren't really about fairness. They were about control, spectacle, and fear. But sometimes, when the theft was big enough, or the thief unlucky enough, the authorities decided that branding and ear-snipping weren't dramatic enough. They wanted a punishment that lingered in the public imagination for years. And so, we drift into the world of executions and post-mortem displays, the grand finales of medieval justice. Hanging was the classic. Simple, effective, and most importantly, cheap. All you needed was a rope and some wood, and suddenly you had a message that thieves should think twice before pocketing someone else's coins. But hangings weren't just quick affairs. Sometimes they were staged on crossroads, places where everyone would pass by sooner or later. A thief dangling in the wind was like a billboard, only less cheerful. People walking by couldn't miss it. Children pointed, merchants sighed in relief, and other thieves got the message. Though, of course, hunger has a way of making people conveniently forget. And then there was the gibbet. This was essentially hanging with extra commitment. Instead of burying the thief after the rope snapped his neck, authorities placed the corpse into an iron cage and left it hanging for weeks, months, sometimes years. Birds picked at the remains, the sun bleached bones. Travelers saw it on the horizon like a grim landmark. Imagine walking past that every day. You definitely remember not to steal your neighbor's chickens. At least, that was the idea. Communities even gave directions based on gibbets. Turn left at the hanging man's cage, then straight on to the village. Not exactly the most welcoming of road signs. Of course, thieves could face other dramatic ends. Burning was rare, but it happened, usually when theft crossed into heresy, sacrilege, or treason. After all, stealing church treasures wasn't just theft. It was an insult to God himself. Authorities needed a punishment that matched the insult. Fire fit the bill. Hot, purifying, terrifying. Watching a thief burn was supposed to cleanse the community and scare the living daylights out of everyone watching. Whether it worked or not is questionable, but it certainly left a memory. And then there were executions that doubled as performances. Punishments could be dragged out with public whippings on the way to the gallows, or forced confessions shouted through the streets. Sometimes thieves had to carry the stolen goods with them, tied around their necks like grim accessories. Imagine stumbling to the scaffold with a stolen ham swinging from a rope, or a sack of grain bouncing against your chest. The crowd laughed, jeered, maybe threw rotten food. It was humiliation, pain, and death rolled into one uncomfortable package. For the really infamous, punishment didn't end at death. Dismemberment could follow. Heads displayed on spikes, hands nailed to gates, entire bodies quartered and scattered across different towns. Each piece became a warning. Don't steal here, or you'll end up like him. It was morbidly practical, really. Why settle for one warning in one village, when you could spread the message across 4? Of course, all this might sound extreme for people who sometimes stole out of sheer hunger. But medieval justice wasn't particularly bothered by motive. Theft was theft, whether it was a loaf of bread or a jewel-encrusted chalice. Courts leaned toward making examples rather than considering circumstances, and so even petty thieves could end up facing punishments that seem wildly disproportionate today. A child caught pickpocketing could be whipped half to death in public. A servant stealing from a master might lose a hand, or worse, dangle from a noose if the master insisted. Mercy existed, but it depended heavily on status, influence, and luck. The higher up you were, the more likely you could pay a fine or talk your way out of it. For the poor, there was rarely an escape. Theatrics mattered too. Punishments weren't designed just to correct thieves. They were staged as entertainment. People gathered for executions like they were heading to a festival. Vendors sold food, musicians sometimes played. Crowds cheered or booed. Children sat on shoulders to get a better view. Think of it like a grim reality show, except instead of being voted off the island, you were literally being strung up on a rope. And the audience loved it. The suffering of others became a shared event, woven into the rhythm of medieval life. But let's not imagine every execution was grand. Sometimes it was just sad. A single thief hanged on a cold morning with hardly anyone watching. No vendors, no music, just silence and a body swaying in the wind. Forgotten after a week, remembered only by the family left behind. Justice, in the medieval sense, didn't care about dignity. It cared about closure, for the community, not for the condemned. So whether it was a quick rope, a smoldering fire, or a creaking iron cage, medieval society found countless ways to ensure thieves were remembered, not kindly, not mercifully, but visibly. Punishment was as much about memory as it was about the act itself. Everyone who passed the gibbet, saw the branding mark, or laughed at the pillory knew the rules of the game. Steal, and you didn't just risk pain. You risked becoming a permanent story. And yet theft never went away. No amount of hanging bodies or caged skeletons could erase hunger, desperation, or greed. People kept stealing, and the punishments kept rolling on, grimly theatrical, endlessly repetitive. A loop that stretched across centuries from medieval towns to lonely crossroads, leaving behind not just scars on individuals, but a whole culture built around the spectacle of justice.
By now, we've seen how brutal, theatrical, and humiliating punishments could be. But it leaves a question hanging in the air, doesn't it? How did ordinary medieval people feel about all this? After all, punishments didn't happen in some hidden dungeon. They were done out in the open, on village greens, in market squares, or at the edges of towns. It wasn't just about the thief and the authorities. It was about the community. Crowds were expected to gather. In fact, their presence was part of the punishment itself. If nobody was there to jeer, laugh, and whisper, the shame factor didn't really work. So villagers came, sometimes willingly, sometimes because it was simply what you did. Life didn't have much entertainment, and punishments filled that void. Watching someone whipped or shoved into the pillory was a grim sort of theater. Not exactly Shakespeare, but it was free and didn't require traveling far. Parents even brought their children along, partly for the lesson, partly for the distraction. But reactions weren't uniform. Not everyone enjoyed watching a thief beaten half to death. Some people winced. Some whispered pity. After all, a thief was often just a neighbor who got caught. Maybe someone you'd known since childhood. Maybe a cousin. Maybe even a friend. Seeing them dragged through the mud was uncomfortable. But showing too much sympathy could be dangerous. If you were caught defending or comforting a thief during punishment, you risked suspicion yourself. Authorities didn't want mercy muddying the spectacle. The punishment was supposed to sting, not soften. So most people swallowed their pity and joined in the laughter, even if half-heartedly. There were also moments of quiet hypocrisy. A crowd might jeer at the thief in the stocks, then later sneak bread into his hands when nobody was looking. People weren't heartless. They knew hunger drove much of the stealing. A child punished for bread tugged at emotions, even if the law didn't care. Sometimes entire communities helped thieves escape harsher sentences. Local juries might downplay the crime, calling a theft small when it was actually larger, just to avoid seeing a neighbor mutilated or killed. Justice was harsh, but it was also bendable, depending on who stood before the court. But there was also enjoyment, plain and simple. Medieval crowds weren't strangers to cruelty. The misfortune of others made for entertainment. Throwing rotten vegetables at someone in the pillory was fun, especially if you didn't like the person anyway. Old grudges found an outlet in these punishments. You couldn't insult your neighbor outright, but if he ended up in the stocks, you suddenly had permission to unload every rotten cabbage you owned. Punishments were cathartic, a strange form of community bonding, as cruel as that sounds. And then there was the darker fascination with suffering. People leaned forward to watch whippings. They gawked at mutilations. They whispered about the smell of burning flesh at executions. In a world where death and hardship were daily realities, punishment wasn't as shocking as it might seem today. It was folded into life, another grim reminder that everyone lived under rules, and breaking them had visible, bloody consequences. Still, not everyone agreed with the harshness. Some priests, writers, and chroniclers criticized the excesses. They argued that mercy mattered, that endless cruelty only bred more crime. But their voices were faint against the louder chorus of law and authority. Fear was easier to maintain than forgiveness. Mercy required trust, and medieval rulers weren't exactly known for trusting their subjects. Behind the scenes, punishments also served a political purpose. They weren't just about thieves stealing from farmers, they were about showing who held power. Every time a thief was whipped, branded, or hanged, the message wasn't just "don't steal." It was "the system owns you." Kings, lords, and councils wanted visible proof of their authority. The thief wasn't just paying for his crime, he was being used as a tool to reinforce the hierarchy. His suffering reminded everyone else where they stood. And the memory lingered. In small villages, people remembered who had been branded, who had lost a hand, who had swung from a rope. Stories were told, retold, and embroidered over time. Children grew up hearing about the thief who was caged on the hill, or the servant who stole a loaf and ended up noseless. Punishments became folklore, shaping how entire communities imagined justice. Even long after the bodies had rotted away, the lesson lived on in whispers. It's ironic, then, that while punishments were designed to terrify, they often inspired a kind of grim respect, too. The thief who endured a public flogging without crying out might be admired quietly. The outlaw who escaped the gallows became a local legend. Even the branded man who carried on living, scarred but unbroken, could be seen as tough, almost heroic. The line between shame and admiration blurred. Authorities wanted pure deterrence, but humans are messy creatures. Sometimes, watching someone punished only made them more memorable. So, medieval communities balanced between pity, cruelty, entertainment, and fear. Punishments were never just about one thief. They were about everyone watching, everyone learning, everyone remembering. The thief was the lesson, and the crowd was the classroom. And yet life went on. Fields had to be plowed, bread baked, markets opened. The thief in the stocks became yesterday's spectacle, quickly replaced by the next misfortune, the next poor soul caught in the endless cycle of crime and punishment. That was medieval life, harsh, repetitive, strangely communal, and never letting anyone forget that the line between law-abiding villager and branded thief was thinner than it seemed.
If you've noticed so far, medieval punishments weren't exactly subtle, but they weren't uniform either. Depending on where you lived, the type of lord you served, and which kingdom you happened to be unlucky enough to steal in, your punishment could look very different. A thief in England might end up dangling from a rope, while one in France could be mutilated, and a thief in the Holy Roman Empire might be shoved into some bizarre contraption that looks like it was invented by someone with far too much free time. In England, for example, hanging became the standard answer to theft. The English crown leaned heavily on the idea of deterrence through death. It was quick, relatively cheap, and required little imagination. But it wasn't always applied equally. Sometimes, juries deliberately undervalued stolen goods to avoid sending someone to the gallows. If the threshold for a hanging was a shilling, a jury might say the stolen cloak was worth only 11 pence, sparing the thief's life. It was a strange balance between law and local sympathy, where ordinary villagers quietly bent the rules to protect their neighbors from the harshest outcomes. France had a slightly different approach. Branding and mutilations were far more common there, especially for repeat offenders. Authorities liked the idea of permanent marks of shame. The famous fleur-de-lis burned into a shoulder was practically a walking warning sign. This one's already been caught. And of course, mutilations sent a clear message too. Thieves with missing hands or ears weren't unusual in French towns. But France also loved theatrical punishment. Thieves might be paraded in costumes, forced to crawl through the streets, or made to shout confessions as they stumbled to the place of judgment. It wasn't just about justice, it was about making sure nobody forgot the humiliation. Then you had the Holy Roman Empire, which never did things halfway.
Its cities and principalities seemed to compete in coming up with inventive punishments. Thieves could find themselves strapped into iron maidens, shoved into cages shaped like animals, or dangled in public squares inside heavy wooden frames. Sometimes they were submerged in rivers, either as punishment or as a so-called trial by water. Survive too easily, and it looked suspicious. Drown, and, well, justice had technically been served, in a roundabout way. German towns also had an interesting fondness for locking thieves in oversized barrels, cutting holes for the head and arms, and then parading them through the streets. Not very dignified, but highly memorable. Italy, with its bustling city-states, mixed justice with politics. Thieves often faced exile rather than execution because cities like Florence and Venice cared deeply about reputation and order. Throwing someone out was easier than building another gibbet. But repeat offenders weren't so lucky. Public whippings, heavy fines, and sometimes even torture followed. Italian records show thieves having their noses cut off, or being strapped to posts in marketplaces as people pelted them with filth. In wealthy merchant cities, theft wasn't just a crime against property, it was seen as an insult to civic pride, and punishments reflected that. Scandinavia, with its smaller communities, leaned toward exile and outlawry. A thief could be declared outside the law, which essentially meant anyone could kill them without consequence. It was a punishment that combined survival and fear. You weren't just cast out, you were declared prey. Sometimes, outlaws banded together in forests or remote places, creating their own shadow societies. It was a lonely, dangerous existence, but for some it was better than losing a hand or facing the rope. Spain combined religious authority with punishment. Stealing church property often resulted in the harshest penalties. Thieves could be forced into humiliating pilgrimages, walking barefoot across vast distances with signs around their necks declaring their crimes. Some were whipped through towns, driven by officials carrying crosses, turning their suffering into a kind of moral theater. And like elsewhere in Europe, branding and mutilation were common too, with the added emphasis that God himself had been offended. Even within one kingdom, punishments could vary wildly. Local lords had broad discretion. What counted as theft in one place might be shrugged off in another. One judge might prefer whipping, another insisted on hanging. There wasn't exactly a central rule book. It depended on custom, whim, and sometimes how irritated a lord felt that day. A thief could hope for leniency, but they could just as easily meet a punishment that seemed wildly disproportionate to the crime. Medieval justice wasn't about consistency. It was about visibility, authority, and fear. But beneath the variations, the goal was always the same. England, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, each wanted to create lasting memory. They wanted punishments to echo, to leave scars, both physical and psychological. A thief wasn't just one person breaking a rule. They were an opportunity, an example to be made, a warning to everyone else. And that warning was tailored differently in every corner of medieval Europe, but always delivered loudly, painfully, and publicly. What's fascinating is how often communities themselves resisted the harshest edges of the law. In England, juries undervalued stolen goods. In France, locals sometimes sheltered repeat offenders. In Germany, neighbors might quietly pity someone strapped into a barrel. Justice was loud, but human sympathy whispered underneath. People could despise theft and still dislike cruelty. The law wanted to erase that nuance, but it always crept back in. So, across medieval Europe, thieves faced a patchwork of punishments. Rope in one place, iron cages in another, exile in the next. Different methods, different tools, but the same underlying principle. Make sure the thief suffers, make sure everyone sees it, and make sure nobody forgets. Whether that meant dangling from a gibbet, stumbling through town with a branded face, or wandering alone as an outlaw, the effect was the same. The thief became a permanent lesson stitched into the fabric of community memory.
So, where were we? Ah, yes, thieves. Let's keep floating along. If you were a thief in medieval Paris, there was a fair chance you'd meet one of the many city sergeants, who were basically proto-police officers with less training and far more enthusiasm for rough handling. Once caught, you could expect to be dragged, not politely escorted, into the bustling square. Now, the French had a flair for making punishments look like public theater. The pillory, for example, was a perfect stage. You'd stand there, head poked through a wooden board, with a crowd treating you like the medieval equivalent of cheap weekend entertainment. People would toss rotten vegetables, or if they were feeling particularly inspired, something worse. Yes, chamber pots were a thing. The whole idea was that public humiliation was supposed to deter crime. But did it work? Not really. All it often did was create a strange kind of celebrity status for some thieves. Imagine being the guy who kept showing up in the pillory every other month. Eventually, the crowd might even start rooting for you, kind of like the world's least glamorous local sports hero. But humiliation wasn't the only tool in the punishment toolbox. Sometimes punishments were oddly specific. For instance, in some places, if you stole bread, you could be forced to carry a heavy loaf around your neck as a shaming symbol. It's not exactly subtle. Everyone knew exactly what you did. And if the bread went stale, well, congratulations. Now you've got a smelly, crumbling necklace of your own crime. Let's float over to the English countryside for a moment. In smaller villages, punishments were often improvised and community-driven. The local lord might not bother dragging every thief to the nearest castle court, so instead, villages themselves came up with punishments. Sometimes that meant tying the thief to a cartwheel and parading them around. Sometimes it meant something as simple as shaving their head as a lifelong mark of shame. Medieval fashion wasn't exactly forgiving, so a badly shaved head could be as humiliating as a scarlet letter. Now, for thieves who were persistent, because yes, there were plenty of repeat offenders, the punishments tended to escalate. First offense, maybe a night in the stocks. Second offense, branding. A nice little letter carved or burned into your flesh. In England, the letter T could be branded on your hand for thief. Subtle, right? You can just imagine trying to shake someone's hand after that. And if you kept going after all that, well, eventually, the rope came out. Hanging was the final stop for many habitual thieves, especially in the later Middle Ages. And it wasn't done quietly either. Executions were public spectacles designed to remind everyone what happened when you couldn't keep your hands off your neighbor's chickens. But here's where things get interesting. Not all thieves faced the same treatment. Wealthy thieves, or those with noble connections, often slipped through the cracks. If you were a poor farmer caught stealing a sheep, you might lose your hand. But if you were a noble caught stealing, well, that wasn't called theft, was it? That was just taxation, or confiscation. Convenient, isn't it? And speaking of sheep, because medieval people loved their sheep, rustling livestock was a very big deal. A chicken stolen was one thing. A sheep or cow, that was basically economic sabotage. Livestock was wealth, food, clothing, and status all wrapped into one. So livestock thieves were treated harshly. Sometimes they were even executed. Because stealing someone's cow wasn't just petty theft, it could threaten their entire livelihood. Let's drift further into the odd punishments. In some German towns, there were cages hung in public squares, iron cages, just big enough to hold a person standing or crouching. Thieves could be locked inside for hours or days, left to the mercy of the weather and the townsfolk. People would gawk, jeer, and occasionally throw things. It was a slow, humiliating ordeal that made the stocks look almost comfortable. And then there was mutilation. Cutting off ears, noses, or hands wasn't uncommon.
The logic was simple. If you take something with your hand, you might just lose the hand. If you keep lying or stealing, you might lose the tongue or the ear. It's grim, but in their minds, it was also efficient. A one-time punishment that marked you forever. It's hard to get away with stealing when your missing hand tells the whole village your life story. What's fascinating, though, is that punishments weren't always meant to be final. Sometimes they were designed to reintegrate you back into society, just in a more embarrassing way. Public shame was supposed to scare you straight. Branding was supposed to remind you every time you used your hand. And the stocks? Well, they were like a medieval timeout, except with less dignity and more cabbage thrown at your head. So, as we float through these strange and uncomfortable punishments, it's worth noticing the common thread. Theft was seen as both a crime and a betrayal of trust. In small, tight-knit communities, stealing wasn't just about the object taken. It was about breaking the fragile balance of survival. Everyone depended on each other to make it through winters and plagues, so when someone took more than their share, punishments had to be not only harsh, but also visible. And yet, despite all these punishments, stocks, branding, mutilations, hangings, thieves kept existing, which suggests one very medieval truth. No matter how many loaves you hang around someone's neck, people will still get hungry enough to steal another one.